This is a very ancient mantra. And this mantra is the embodiment of X factor. And the mantra will take X factor inside the human body, and if it's repeated under certain circumstances 6,400,000 times, give or take 5 or 6 times, the human body transforms itself. Would you like to know what that mantra is? I've never had a group say no to that question.
Thinking about the first time that we met, thinking about the time when you hugged it, laughing at the good time that we had, even time when sorrow made us sad. Yo, reminisce on the Spanish we had.
This is the Dark Enlightenment with your host, MARKSSIUS Hill, aka House Hill, the 2-3 of MCs. Welcome to Enlightenment. Peace.
Think about it, think about it, about it, 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 think about it.
The first force that acted upon the universe is called the A factor. This is what we would call God, and this is the first force acting to emerge what we would call reality in the form of the 8th dimension.
When Mr. Mitchell Gibson is explaining these different factors, it's very important that you try to pay attention because they are strikingly similar to things I've heard in the past. These different forces, these different vibrations, it's no different than the music you might listen to at a certain frequency. Pay attention to the factors. Each one of them has a very different effect, very different inner working and purpose. So as you pay attention to these factors, we're going to proceed on into how that will go into meditating, maybe saying mantras, and different things that can upgrade your evolution in spirituality and consciousness, and also help your life force overall to help you live longer, to help you after this, which a lot of us don't want to think about, but you need mastery of everything. Don't live in fear. You got to get it done. X factor seems to be a very important factor in transforming yourself into what you're supposed to be, the primordial being that's inside of you, that body of light. Now we're not saying you have to transform yourself totally, but think about even getting close. It would be amazing, and you'd be a spectacular individual. You'd be an exceptional individual at the same time. Spiritual growth, consciousness wide open. So we strive to gain. We strive to take advantage of the X factor.
The purpose of A factor is to separate humanity or to separate reality from what we call God. It's called the factor of the first propagation. It separates everything that exists from what we call the state of non-existence or God. God would be, in our terms of discussion here, the term or the sum of all potentials, The A factor causes things to be created in their original primordial form. That's what A factor does. A factor acts through all the different dimensions. It causes a person to say, I am. I am Mitchell, I am a plant, I am an animal, I'm a fish, I'm a tree, etc., etc. It causes beings to want to express themselves in form. Before that, all things are formless. The purpose of the A factor is to give reality a form, a way that it can experience itself and experience the universe. B factor acts on the fifth dimension for one particular purpose. B factor is a universal force that causes energy in the fifth dimension to be returned back to the ninth dimension or God. The A factor wants to push everything as far away from God as it can. But the B factor wants to turn things back to God. It's also called the immortality factor. It wants to make things immortal. The next factor is called the X factor. The X factor acts on the third dimension, which is where we live, to place things in the fifth dimension. Now, this is the source of a lot of the meditation practices that we just talked about that take advantage of this X force or X factor that exists inside of all of us. Every one of us have this. It's called, another word for it in our Western society, you might also call it the Christ force.
To relate to the people in our Western society, he had to call it the Christ force. Now, isn't that interesting? And you know exactly why he had to call it that, so he can relate to us. And so that says that our only relation to any spirituality is Christ. I reject that. I think there's a lot of knowledge out here that's restricted because of Christianity. But I think it was useful in molding me into being a moral individual. So I'm not dissing Christianity totally, but the current setup, the current status is that we have this blasphemy mind state. Don't say that. You can't say that. You're not supposed to look at that. You're not supposed to lean into your own understanding. All these things were said to keep you restricted from gaining knowledge. And I totally disagree with that, because that's the opposite of your purpose here. Your purpose here is to gain knowledge, to take it back to creation, to the entity, the thing, the immeasurable enigma that made you. So deep that your current understanding couldn't even describe it. So when we try to even think about describing that entity that created this life force for us, how could you do it? Be real with yourself.
The X factor exists in all of us. You can measure it using certain techniques. The X factor has one goal. X factor takes the 97% of our DNA and turns it into a light body. That's what the X factor does. That's its function. All of us walk around with the X factor being dormant inside of our bodies all the time.
I do believe you are a light being trapped in this shell, this thing we call a body. When you go to where they keep bodies at, there's a cemetery, they're not there. The light has left. And that's all the essence is. Come here, you get influenced by the earth within this shell, and you get out of here with that information. You take it to where it needs to be. Complete your task. Live up to your part of the deal. Knowledge through wisdom. And live out your experiences in life. Try to enjoy yourself. I know it's hard, because life's hard. We're in the third dimension after all. It's the bad neighborhood of the spiritual world.
There are specific meditation techniques that have been devised over centuries to take advantage of that dormant state or that dormant force. There's another factor called Z factor that has a different sort of force or action. Z factor is another term for death or chaos. The Z factor has one goal, and the Z factor's goal is to make sure that when you live a life, it make sure that your body gets dissolved back into matter or back into the constituent parts of reality that created it. The Z factor also causes death, and aging, and illness. X factor can be generated. It's a dormant factor. Now, some people, when they generate this, their bodies begin to change. They develop healing ability. Their body begins to give off light. They begin to be able to float, for instance. They also begin to transform themselves, and because of the activity of this particular factor, people are often sainted. So what are some of the ways that this factor can be activated? Because one of the things that happens when you activate it, people become incorrupt. An incorrupt body is a body that doesn't decay normally. When I studied forensics, we had to study bodies in different forms of decay. And you can actually determine how long a person's been dead by the insects inside of that person at the time of your study. Certain insects come at particular times of decay. But an incorrupt body doesn't have that. There have been incorrupt bodies found in mud. And mud is one of the fastest ways people decay. Also, there have been incorrupt bodies found that have been hung and people that were crucified in the air. And the air is actually the fastest way that people decay. The air has more bacteria in it than the ground.
A lot of y'all are gonna rot immediately. I'm talking about time is over with, boom, you might just turn immediately into a skeleton because you are corrupt. So we provide this knowledge to try to upgrade. You know, I'm not saying I'm perfect. No one is. I'm a human man. So that's what it is. But at the same time, you strive to be your best version. You strive for spiritual consciousness growth. You strive for growth in both of those areas. So even though when we say we're just a man, she's just a woman, you have to live up to a higher standard because in your DNA is the capability to be a light being. Whether you want to call that a God or whatever you want to call it, it's another state that's waiting for you. So always keep that in mind. Don't limit yourself to your own understanding, and especially when you don't look to gain understanding.
So what are some of the ways that we might generate this X factor? Just if you think about it for a second.
Meditation or prayer?
That's right, meditation and prayer.
Sacred sexuality or tantra?
We can use tantra. They don't like to talk about tantra in the West because that's sex. But it is a path to enlightenment by using this factor. There's also one very powerful method we haven't mentioned yet. Mantras, that's right. There's also another way that we haven't talked about. There's a technique by which you can take in sunlight, using sunlight in combination with a very particular type of meditation to transform yourself and take advantage of the X factor.
X factor seems to be a very important factor in transforming yourself into what you're supposed to be, the primordial being that's inside of you, that body of light. Now we're not saying you have to transform yourself totally, but think about even getting close. It would be amazing, and you would be a spectacular individual. You'd be an exceptional individual at the same time. Spiritual growth, consciousness wide open. We strive to take advantage of the X factor.
Let's talk about sunlight, because it's not just light. When you're doing research in spirituality, you might notice that most of the ancient cultures seem to worship the sun in some form. In ancient Rome and Greece, they had gods for the sun. In the Babylonian tradition, there were gods for the sun. In Christianity, Christ was associated with the sun. In Judaism, there was a form of meditation that's associated with sunlight, taking in sunlight. Even in China and India, there's a solar aspect to worship. There are a number of different aspects to sunlight that help us with the process of evolution, that can also help lead us to a better understanding of the spiritual world. There are things inside of sunlight spiritually that most of us don't know about. One thing that's inside of sunlight, obviously, is electromagnetic energy. We call that light. That's the easiest thing to sort of understand about sunlight. When you look at the sun is bright. It gives off energy. But that's just one of the things inside of the sun that is being generated by the sun. The sun also generates something called information factors. An information factor is pure energy being generated by the sun that contains information about the creation of reality. It's not electromagnetic in nature. That's from a science called cosmology. It comes from a combination of two words, cosmic and logos. It's also called cosmic cosmology or solar logos. So it's a combination of words that basically means information derived from the sun. Information that has been passed down to us from the Gnostics. Gnostics, especially the Essene Gnostic tradition, was a solar tradition, which essentially taught that human beings are derived from primordial beings that emanate from the sun. And that part of what controls our reality is an understanding of the higher forces that emanate from the sun and how the mind and the soul interact with them. Let's get back to the list of things inside sunlight. Another thing that's inside sunlight is called the evolutionary factor. The evolutionary factor was only added to sunlight by certain beings about 250,000 years ago. One of the reasons this factor was added, according to the teachings, is that human beings began to become somewhat lazy and cumbersome in their understanding of the universe. The evolutionary factor was added to make us curious about the universe. Another thing that's inside of the sun that doesn't really fit into our normal understanding of what comes from the sun are called mandalas, specifically divine mandala. Divine mandala are geometric forms. If you look at sunlight, one of the things you notice if you begin to look at it for a while is you begin to see geometric shapes. And these shapes don't really make any sense when you first begin to look at them. But there's been an exhaustive study of these shapes by a number of some of the deeper esoteric spiritual religions. And it shows that these shapes have a tremendous effect on the subconscious processes of the human mind. Essentially, it's a way to guide us back toward enlightenment. It contains information in a very highly complex geometric form that leads the subconscious mind on sort of a journey through life, so that people develop a hunger for reality, for understanding the deeper forces of reality. It's where our desire to know God comes from. There's one other force. Actually, one of the things that composes the human body are these divine mandala. Each of us has stored inside of us certain mandala that, once you master them, will enable you to do things that look like miracles. They're not really miracles, but when you understand what the mandala does, you can control certain forces like gravity or the force of light or other forces in the universe that are connected to that particular mandala. Fifth thing that's inside of it are universal forces. One of those universal forces is the X factor. All of that comes through sunlight.
Whether you believe in the factors that exist in the sun or not, science even proves that being in the sun is healthy. It's good for you. It helps you mentally, physically. And so I'm sure that will trickle down to spiritual health, consciousness, all the other unseen tangibles that involve our personality. So when we're talking about sunlight, I think it's much deeper than we perceive it to be. The sun provides life for this whole earth. So its vitality, its life force, what it provides is major presence in our life. It says something. It's like nature talking to us. And so we have to take notice of that. Even now, on the next level side of the game, I'm picturing these TVs that are just total holograms. Like, Your iPhone is gonna be something that just shoot, and it's gonna be a see-through image, just like the phone itself. It's gonna be merely nothing. I don't know how you might have something on your finger right here, but I'm sure that's gonna happen before I die. I'm almost sure. And that's the next level side of the game, prediction. But we all know that stuff's gonna happen anyway, so technology is moving so fast. And which, by the way, is because of alien encounters. But don't send me to the crazy house yet. I'm saying. That was The Spiritual World by The Spiritual Word by Dr. Mitchell Gibson. I thought it was The Spiritual World, but I saw this video about 5-6 years ago, and it was life-changing for me. I've had a couple of texts that I've read like that, and a couple of presentations that I've seen like that, and this was one of them. So I'm going to try to present everything that affected me in that manner to you for spiritual growth of the consciousness, so we can make this world a better place. We can do it at the drop of a dime if we chose. I hope you enjoyed The Spiritual World. I hope we want to give a special thanks, shout out to Mitchell Gibson. Spectacular presentation. I enjoyed it. Thought it was it was full of wisdom and through knowledge through wisdom. And I think it'll help in your growth. That's what it's all about. House Hill, Dark Enlightenment. Peace. House Hill, Dark Enlightenment. Peace. House Hill, Dark Enlightenment. Peace. That was more of this video. He got more in depth about how the sun functioned and what was involved in the spirituality of it. But hopefully we can find that and review the rest of it if it was enough. But
early in my training, I didn't believe any of this. I didn't, like some of you probably look at that and say, well, that's not possible. Well, I've learned to say that impossible just takes a little bit of time. Because as we grow in our understanding of the universe, we begin to see that what we thought was impossible 100 years ago is sort of accomplished in a daily manner now.
everything that we see today is something that we have once thought of. If you think about it, we created this reality that we're in. I remember thinking as a young boy, man, it'd be nice if I could have a watch and I could watch TV on it. Man, I think I might have been 9-10 years old when I thought about that. And I thought to myself, well, that probably never happened while I'm alive. I remember thinking that when I was a little boy. But I always thought about that watch. And every time a new watch came out that was more high-tech and more high-tech, I wanted that watch. Closer and closer we got to that TV on that watch, I was finna get somewhere. Here we go today. TV on the watch.
So let's look at the spiritual world and the path into what we call physical existence. The spiritual world starts from what we call the 99% world, which is very similar to what Kabbalah teaches about there being a very evolved or much higher form of reality beyond our physical world, from which all the other dimensions sort of derive. Our dimension is way down here, close to the 1% world, which is also something called null space, which is devoid of reality as we know it. Each of these dimensions as you go down from the Godhead, or what we call the Creator, sort of devolves in complexity. So by the time you get to the fourth or the third dimension, reality is not quite as complex. Beings become subject to something we call death. So as we were talking about earlier, Christology is the science that we're talking about. It's a very ancient science that was propagated primarily by ancient Gnostics, primarily from the Essenes. The Essenes were a very, for lack of a better word, they were a very interesting group. There are stories among the older ancient Essene cultures that they had a secret technique called the paradosis. The paradosis was a technique that involved taking in sunlight, among other things. And through the paradosis, one was able to transform themselves from a mortal being into an immortal being made of something other than physical matter. The paradosis was something that was only passed to the elder elect members of the Essenes, never to the women, which was sort of unusual. Because if you're going to be immortal, why not have women around? But that's just me.
That's interesting. I wonder why they didn't pass the tradition on to the women. I won't trip. You know what, women, some of you deserve to be gods also, or light beings. I do believe that. Some of you, probably at a 1% percentile, but some of you. Probably at a very low percentile, but I would say some of you. The ones that are logical.
Oh, let's go over what these universal forces are. The paradosis takes into account one of these particular forces. In particular, takes into account the B factor, which we'll go over in a few minutes. These universal forces we're going to talk about, and I'm leaving one out on purpose. The A factor we're going to go over, the B factor we'll go over, X, Y, and Z factors. I'm leaving out the H factor because that's a factor that has to do with causing someone intentional harm. You can take advantage of that and learn about that when you're being trained in sort of the dark arts, but I don't train people or talk to people about that in particular. So let's talk about the factors one at a time. The first factor that we're going to talk about is called the A factor. And the A factor causes the propagation of self-propagation by which God is separated from himself and he disseminates himself throughout the universe. It's the first force that is taught in this science that is created. It's the first universal force that we have identified or that has been identified by the ancients. It's the first cause of emergence. One of my teachers was a Kabbalist, a very old Kabbalist, and I wondered just how old this guy was. But he told me a story about how the first force came into being, and I kind of like the story because it condenses it into something I could understand easily. He said, what if you knew a man who was extremely wealthy, and this man came to your home every day and said, I want to take you out to dinner and buy you things. And that might be cool the first time or two. And the next day this man calls and said, I want to take you out to dinner and show you the town. After 3 or 4 times of doing that, most of us would start to get a little bit uncomfortable that this person was doing everything for us. And that ultimately we would want to do some things for ourselves. So we would say, well, okay, if we go out to dinner today, let me pick up the check. And the man says, no, I insist. You can never pick up the check. It's always going to be me paying for everything. Well, most people eventually not want to go out with that man anymore. Why? In that relationship, you feel like you have no power. You're constantly being given to, even though that's great for a little bit, but you have no power.
Exactly.
And so my teacher said that this is the way that humans in the beginning, in the primordial state, saw God. That God was primarily giving us everything we ever needed, and we never had to do anything. And so that some of us said, I want to create my own apple pie. I want to create my own reality. I want to create my own everything so that I can feel the pleasure of giving things to myself. And so the first force was created by God as a way of pushing us into a universe where we could create things for ourselves. Now, some people like to say, well, I wasn't in that group. I didn't get consulted on that. But that's the way my teacher explained the propagation of the first force. It's a way to empower ourselves outside of the Godhead so that we could create reality and take advantage of it. We could work, we could get a wage, and give ourselves things that we needed.
Now, in these scenarios that Mr. Gibson is giving, you have to be a good person. You have to be decent. You have to be high in spirit and consciousness. You have to want to do the right thing. So keep that in mind when he's giving his scenario on how you would want to do for yourself, which is the way it should be in all cases, as a man and as a woman.
The next factor that came about is called the B factor. And the B factor is where the paradosis comes in. The A factor separates souls or spirits from God in the spiritual world. And it also caused death ultimately, because the ultimate separation from God is a form of death, in a way. The B factor was created as a counteractant or a counteragent to the A factor. And in the B factor, there is an urge to reunite with the source of all creation, with the Creator Himself. It is the force for spiritual evolution. In our higher levels of intelligence, B factor is extremely active. Now, in the ancient times, when the paradosis was taught, they would give the aspirant what they called the spiritual touch. And basically, they would touch you on the forehead. And the master would pass energy into the aspirant, and then the aspirant was given a mantra. It wasn't really a mantra so much as it was a word. Now, in the Essene accounts of Jesus' baptism, it was essentially a paradosis or an event of the paradosis given by John the Baptist to Jesus himself. It's how Jesus was given the energy of divinity or higher divinity. And in the deeper mystery of that, Jesus was being initiated into a power that would later turn him into the Christ, the B factor, or the immortal factor, let's put it that way. It later immortalized him in a certain way.
It did immortalize him in a certain way. In our thoughts, in our minds, in our hearts.
The X factor is another one of these forces that has a very specific job. The X factor is a force that takes the human form and is generated through actually there's two places the X factor comes from. It can come through all the areas we talked about, those 5 areas. It comes from the sun. Also, the earth generates a certain amount of X factor. And to be honest, the human body generates a certain amount of X factor. A friend of mine who is an astronomer at the University of Arizona talks about his research, and in his research, he did radio astronomy on the human body. If you look at the human body generates the same radiation as a star. So that radio telescopes had to be built far away from cities because human beings, when you point a radio telescope at a city, human beings light up like stars. We put out the same type of radiation. One of these radiations is the X factor. It's very weak in most humans until they learn to bring it out more.
The human body radiates the same radiation as a star. Wow. I found that very fascinating. Given our close proximity to being a direct descendant of the stars. So,
this X factor has one focus, and that's to change the dormant 97% of human tissue into an immortal form. Now there's a mantra that you can use, and this is a very ancient mantra, And this mantra is the embodiment of X Factor. And the mantra will take X Factor inside the human body, and if it's repeated under certain circumstances, 6,400,000 times, give or take 5 or 6 times, the human body transforms itself. Would you like to know what that mantra is? I've never had a group say no to that question.
Now, I know some of us are spooked by saying certain things in a chant or, something we're not familiar with. But look it up. I'm not going to tell you what it means. If you even give a care as enough, you go look it up and do your own spiritual growth and get your own knowledge and grow your own consciousness, because that's what you want, right? Otherwise, you're not even worthy of saying it, I don't think. So, this was the kind of thing that I hope people take notice of, because this mantra has done some spectacular things in my life. And if you don't, you don't. If you do, you do. But mantras are good.
Forgive my doctor's writing. It says, Om Ahum Vajra Guru Pima Siddhi Hum. Now this is a very ancient mantra. It's in Sanskrit, a form of Sanskrit. And the purpose of this mantra is several-fold. It slows down the aging process in humans. It also is called the immortal mantra. It energizes the X factor inside of humans. Also, it's a mantra that you can use with your solar meditation. Om Ahum Vajra Guru Pima Siddhi Hum. Om Ahum Vajra Guru Pima Siddhi Hum. Let me just give you a little bit of background about how you can apply this. The sun doesn't always radiate the same kind of energy. First thing in the morning, from sunrise to approximately 1 hour afterwards, the sun is radiating primarily X factor. From 1 hour before sunset till after sunset, the sun radiates B factor and a little bit of X. In the hours intervening, the sun is radiating primarily Y factor and Z factor, which are very destructive factors.
So keep in mind, there are specific times that you're supposed to say this mantra, and that certain times can be destructive to your life force. So, I don't know if you take things like this seriously. I do. But just be careful when you're doing things. Be knowledgeable. And make sure you trust your source. You can trust me. But say the mantra. Be well.
The time that the sun is going to come up is going to change depending on where you are. For instance, if you were in the Arctic, there are times of the year where the sun is almost always in sort of a low 1 hour away from sunrise or sunset position. Well, at those times, you're going to always be getting X and B. Now, why am I giving you this? For instance, if you're meditating first thing in the morning around sunrise, and the sun is emanating X factor, and you're saying this particular prayer, you're setting up a resonance between yourself and the sun, and you're setting up a pathway so that your body, instead of receiving a subconscious amount of X factor, you're going to start to receive many times more than the average person of X factor, so that you begin to accelerate the process of your own evolution. And this is actually a specific type of meditation, where you get up first thing in the morning, you face the sun, and you don't just face it and sort of look at it with your eyes closed. There's a specific way to look at it. When you look at the sun first thing in the morning, sunlight's really different. Yes. Yes.
I have a question. Who's your teacher?
I've had several teachers.
I mean, in the Dzogchen tradition, who's your teacher?
It's not a Dzogchen teacher.
This is a
Toph
Dzogchen.
was my first teacher.
Well, what Tibetan Lama do you study with?
Wasn't a Tibetan Lama.
This is a Dzogchen Ati Yoga practice you're talking about. And
It's actually older than that.
Oh.
Much
Okay.
older.
There are serious prohibitions about giving this practice.
Well, this
You do
isn't
know
the
that.
this isn't the Dzogchen practice.
This is a Dzogchen practice.
But it's older than that.
Okay.
So this is well known outside the Dzogchen community.
You've not practiced with a Dzogchen master, right?
Not a Dzogchen master.
Are you a Buddhist?
I like Buddhism.
Okay. Thanks.
Mitchell Gibson dropping bombs on them spiritually, mentally, through the inspiration of thought. My man.
In this technique, there's a certain way to look at the sun. First thing you do is you imagine that the sun is a disk, like a clock. And each of these disks, each part of the disk can be separated into 4 parts. And so you begin saying your mantra, Om Ahum Vajra Guru Pima Siddhi Hum, at 12 o'clock. And you say it about this far, about 2 solar disk diameter away from the sun itself. And this is only at sunrise. Don't do this at midday when the sun is pretty bright. And at sunrise, the sun is not going to hurt your eyes. So you say it at each of these stations 5 seconds. So, Om Ahum Vajra Guru Pima Siddhi Hum, you can say it about 2 or 3 times at each station.
That was The Spiritual World by The Spiritual Word by Dr. Mitchell Gibson. I thought it was The Spiritual World, but I saw this video about 5-6 years ago, and it was life-changing for me. I've had a couple of texts that I've read like that, a couple of presentations that I've seen like that, and this was one of them. So I'm going to try to present everything that affected me in that manner to you for spiritual growth of the consciousness, so we can make this world a better place. We can do it at the drop of a dime if we chose. I hope you enjoyed The Spiritual World. I hope we want to give a special thanks, shout out to Mitchell Gibson. Spectacular presentation. I enjoyed it. Thought it was it was full of wisdom and through knowledge through wisdom. And I think it'll help in your growth. That's what it's all about. House Hill, Dark Enlightenment. Peace. House Hill, Dark Enlightenment. Peace. House Hill, Dark Enlightenment. Peace.